morning. Good morning. I'm Gilda Wheeler, and I'm happy to welcome you this morning to the Computer Science Standards webinar. I want to start out by just making sure that people can hear us okay. So if you're having any technical difficulties, if you're not hearing this clearly, can you just write us a note in the chat box or the question box in your lower right-hand corner? And we'll start in just a minute here. Or how about if you are hearing us fine, can you just say yes or let us know in the chat box, in the message box. Okay, so good morning. I'm Gilda Wheeler. I'm the Senior Program Officer with Washington STEM, and I'm here with my colleague, Greg Bianchi. And Greg is leading the review of our computer science standards for Washington STEM. As I'm sure most of you know, Washington STEM is a nonprofit education organization. We're focused on accelerating innovative, equitable, and scalable STEM education in Washington. And computer science is one of our 5 current STEM education initiatives, the others being engineering education, early math, teaching quality, and career-connected learning. But the purpose of the webinar today is to offer an overview of the computer science standards review process and provide ways for people across the state to contribute to this review. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post it shortly so you can have access to this information very shortly. We'll have it on our Washington STEM website. And the webinar is going to be about 30 minutes long, including time for questions. So use the comment box on the right side, comment or question box on the right side of your screen, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. In 2015, the state legislature directed the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to adopt nationally recognized computer science standards. OSPI contracted with Washington STEM to help with the process to review, contribute to, and adopt these computer science standards. And there's some language of the House Bill 1813 that was passed in 2015. We're currently engaged in this process, and so I'm going to turn the mic over to Greg Bianchi. He is, as I said, is leading this review process for Washington STEM on behalf of OSPI. And we're very fortunate to have Greg on our team, as he is an education leader with deep knowledge and experience in computer science education. So Greg, take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. Good morning. Just setting the context for House Bill 1813, and I think it's important to point out that the why for this work, it has a lot to do with, of course, the shifting economy and the needs that our students will have in the 21st century skill set and workplace. And when we think about some of the statistics that are relevant here, we know that there's a large STEM gap, but what isn't always discussed as much is just how much of that has to do with computer science. So when we look, for example, at our STEM gap, in fact, 60% of that gap is made up by the computer science field. So that really just speaks to the emerging relevance of that skill set and its importance for our students going forward. There's also a big equity piece here that's important to point out. When we look at AP Computer Science, which is a typical capstone for a computer science pathway, we know that in general there are not a lot of course taking or even offerings, with only 7% of schools even offering AP Computer Science. But when we dig down even deeper into that, we can see within that, those students that take AP Computer Science, there are large populations of students that are really underrepresented. In particular, students of color and women continue to be underrepresented. So this is important context as we think about House Bill 1813, the new standards, and really the push to look at how can we introduce and prepare all students for success as it relates to computer science, and how can we really shift our offerings in the school systems to meet that need. One of the, I think, keys is to recognize that in restoring that equity concern and looking to prepare all students, there's the need to begin early. So when we're looking at the computer science framework and standards, that's something that we certainly intend to make sure is occurring, is that standards and framework are addressing the needs of all students, even at kindergarten. So this is about a K-12 pathway for students, not just middle school, secondary computer science offerings. So the pathway that's being followed in developing the new set of computer science standards really resembles the next generation science standards, and that's not coincidental. The groups that are organizing the standards have actually consulted with Achieve, which was the group that helped usher in the next generation science standards. And the process there was that a framework was published for K-12 science education, and that framework informed ultimately the next generation science standards. So there's a similar process here. There's two organizations that are doing this work. The first is K12CS.org, and that organization is really spearheaded by Code.org, but it's not only Code.org. There's several other organizations, including ACM. There are private organizations. There are states participating, including Washington as the lead state in this organization. And the goal here is to develop that framework, and that's the high level, what all students should know about computer science. So you can think of it as the baseline literacy for computer science. And in parallel, CSTA is developing a revised set of K-12 computer science standards. So those two are working together to make sure that those standards really reflect the vision of the framework. And so what we'll talk again about today is where are we participating as a state, and how can you as an individual participate in this process? So in terms of a state level committee, we have put together a state committee that includes representation from multiple organizations, including our K-12 systems, our higher education, OSPI, and private organizations as well. And the charge of that committee is to provide feedback to the organizations that are authoring both the framework and the standards. So that's K12CS.org in the case of the framework, and CSTA for the standards. And of course, in addition to providing feedback and having a hand in how those are developed, the committee will ultimately determine the implications for Washington State and then make a recommendation to the superintendent about the appropriate course of action related to the standards. Just as a reminder, the framework and the standards in terms of how those are different, again, that framework is a high-level kind of definition of what we would want all students to know about computer science. It's the baseline literacy, if you will. The standards are going to be much more granular. They're going to be grade-level specific. For example, they really target specific skills and combine some of the concepts and practices that occur in the framework into individual standards. So we'll look at an example of how a concept and practice from the framework could be combined to create a standard for a particular grade level. In terms of the timeline, the review process is actually ongoing. So both K12CS.org, which is authoring the framework, and CSTA have opened review periods. They both already have had one, and K12CS.org recently opened the second review period for the framework. And CSTA will also open a second review period for the standards in roughly a month or so. So that review is ongoing. In terms of when this work would be completed, CSTA anticipates to release their standards in July at their national conference, and K12CS.org is anticipating a release of the framework this September. At some point this summer or perhaps early fall, the Washington Committee will make a recommendation to OSPI in terms of the adoption of the standards. And just some quick history on the standards. CSTA's prior version of the standards was published in 2011. So again, this is a revision, and in terms of things that we expect to see in that, we can talk about some of the review lenses that our group's looking for, but certainly that K-12 piece, the focus on equity, these are important considerations as we look at the new standards. Let me first show an example of how the framework could be used to create standards, right? If you think of the framework, it really could be used for multiple purposes, but in its relationship to standards, it's really about how can we combine concepts and practices at particular grade levels to create standards. So what you see here is an example of how a concept plus a practice could be put together to create a standard. All right. In terms of review lenses, there are certainly many, but some of the ones that I wanted to highlight here that are important for our committee are to look at, as we're reviewing standards, the relevance and clarity of that standard. So do we feel like that's approachable? And this is something that the framework is also really prioritizing, is that really a computer science novice should be able to read the framework and standards. So it should not be so techy that someone can't enter in, read the standards, and understand what's being asked. So that is how it's being defined by the framework authors and by CSTA, is this idea that we would like a computer science novice to be able to read and understand the standards. And so that's the lens that we're using as our committee reads the standards and the framework. We're also looking at the question of diversity and how well the standards and framework really serve populations that are historically underrepresented. The question of if they're developmentally appropriate. So there is a sequence. There's that K-12 ladder. So do we feel that the standards as written are appropriate for the grade level that's being targeted? Another really important consideration is the opportunity for interdisciplinary connection. So as we think about all students and providing the opportunity for every child to engage in computer science education, we recognize that has to go outside of, for example, CTE. And while it will certainly include CTE, we also have to think about, do the standards suggest or lend themselves to opportunities for teachers to make interdisciplinary connections where we can integrate, for example, a computer science standard with a science, a social studies, a math standard. And then finally, how well do the standards contribute to readiness when we think about the need for college and career readiness for our students? And just again to highlight the importance of the interdisciplinary piece, there are certainly many resources under development. There's many grant funds available to organizations to publish and create interdisciplinary tools and resources. And I think what's important for us to consider is that the framework can really be a way, and the standards can be a way for school systems, teachers to navigate the plethora of resources that will be available. Right, with so many organizations creating resources and targeting them at educators related to computer science, there will be just a plethora of resources for teachers and school administrators to navigate. So the standards and the framework can really be a guide to help move through that and select the most appropriate tools for their students. This is the current draft. If we look at the framework, I've mentioned the concept and practices. So these are the 5 core concepts that I'm projecting here on the left, and then on the right you can see the core practices. So again, these would be the 2 that would be combined to generate standards, and that of course would be done at each grade level. Okay, and just a reminder that the review period is ongoing, and so what I'd like to do is also indicate that, well, the committee, the Washington State Committee, is participating in that review of the framework and the standards. The framework review is actually open right now to all. So if you are particularly interested in participating in this and wondering, what can you do to engage in this process, to learn more, and to even give feedback, you can go to k12cs.org. The second review period is underway right now. It began on March 18th, so this Friday. The release of the new edition or version of the framework occurred, and the review period is now open and will be open until April 5th. So I would encourage anyone who has interest in this to go in and certainly review the framework documents that are now publicly available, and also take advantage of the opportunity to give feedback. And K12CS.org does suggest its own review lenses, some of which are the ones that I shared with you, and there are certainly others. So they really welcome many perspectives in looking at these documents. That's really our kind of big picture overview of the process that's occurring here and how we are as a state participating in the review and development of both the framework and the standards. We're going to pause at this time to take questions about the process or any questions you might have about any aspect of the framework and standards review.
Thank you, Greg. As Greg said, if you have questions or comments, you can use your question or comment box in your lower right-hand corner. So we'll wait a few minutes and see if there's anything that you'd like us to address. If you have any questions about anything on the slides, again, they'll be posted on our website, so you'll be able to review those. And we really do encourage you to take a look at the drafts and provide your input, because that will be listened to. And we want this, as it already is, we want it to be a collective process from the state to the organizers of these documents. And we really value your input. We value the time that you took today to listen in. And again, if you have any questions, it doesn't look like there are questions at this point.
You could also have, if you don't, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if that's a little easier for people.
Okay. We'll just wait another minute or two. I think Greg did a really thorough overview of the process and let you know what you can do. So again, do take advantage of this fairly short time period for review that we have right now. And then, as Greg said, there'll be other review periods between now and the adoption at the end of the summer. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and close the webinar. Again, we'll post it and we'll send that link out to all of the people that have attended. We really appreciate you taking time on a Monday morning. And again, thanks, Greg, for your efforts, and all of the folks that are on our review committee as well. So,
thank you, and thank you for participating today.
All right.